Well, we're here today in South Australia with the independent Senator Rex Patrick. And we've just seen on the news bulletins that a state of emergency, that Scott Morrison is about to declare a state of emergency. Now, if you've been in northern New South Wales or Queensland, you would know that there's been a state of emergency going on now for 2 weeks. What I'd like to know, Rex, you work in the same building as these blokes. What is going on in their minds? They've got the disaster relief fund that they apparently can't spend. They've got a state of emergency 2 weeks late. They've got the ADF copping criticism because of photo opportunities. What's going on? Are these guys completely incompetent, or is there some other agenda?
Yeah, look, I just want to be very clear. I do work in the same building, but I'm certainly not a member of any of the party, either in government or in opposition. Look, I know these people well. They're just regular people, and they're not necessarily the best person to do the job. It's not a meritocracy inside the parliament. You have to have done well within the party. You have to come from the right faction. You get assigned a ministry not because you are the best person in Australia to deal with that particular role. I don't understand what's going on. You know, the state of emergency is just totally mind-blowing to me. There's clearly been a state of emergency in Queensland and northern New South Wales for the last couple of weeks. We haven't responded well, and the moment Sydney gets hit, suddenly a declaration is made. That tells me that for some reason people are treating Sydneyites as a different class of people to the rest of Australians, and that's really wrong.
Absolutely. So now you've been having a stoush over the fuel excise, and you're trying to get this idea across the line that one way to fund this sort of disaster relief, in fact, keep the economy going during a difficult time because oil and gas prices are going through the roof thanks to the Russia invasion of Ukraine. What sort of reception are you getting to this idea? Tell us about the idea about raising this. Is it $6 billion?
Yeah, look, right now we've got fuel prices above $2.20. They're going to go probably up to $2.50 a litre. This is hurting families. It's hurting small businesses in the wake of COVID. It's not a discretionary spend for most people. They have to drive to work. They have to drive their kids to school. They might need to go to a medical centre. They need to go and do their grocery shopping. So this is really, really hurting, and the government's just blind to that hurt. They're not listening to what's happening out there. So I want to cut the fuel excise. People need to understand that every time they fill up their tank, 44 cents per litre goes to the government, goes straight to Josh Frydenberg and to Scott Morrison. We could halve that to give relief. That would cost $6 billion. But the government's resisting that. And they're doing so in circumstances where they put $16 billion aside to pork barrel to try and win a marginal seat, to try and get favour from specific groups in order to buy votes, instead of helping everyday Australians who need a bit of relief right now.
Well, it makes sense logically for the economy too, because it would stimulate the economy. It'd be equivalent to $6 billion worth of stimulus. I mean, there's also the diesel fuel rebate. Have you talked about that as well? Because that's effectively a subsidy for large mining companies and farmers.
Yeah, look, I've just stuck to what is going to mostly hurt people or help people rather on in the community and the small businesses. So I've been focusing on fuel excise. I think it's something that could be utilised to relieve or ease the squeeze, and to also avoid the inflationary effects that will come from these high fuel prices. The government is not listening.
So if you stimulate the economy by $6 billion, they lose $6 billion there, and they would. It gets back to that point of what is going on in their minds. They're always late to the party by the time they act. Seems to be always focus grouped or something. But let's just say, if there's this $6 billion there, are they thinking that, we can't do that because we'd have to make up the $6 billion for our budget deficit, and that would frig around with our forecasts coming into the election budget, which is impending? I mean, is that what they're thinking? They're running it as a household budget because they stimulated the economy by well over 300 billion during the pandemic. Nobody seems to be talking about that. There is this money tree. What are they doing about that?
Yeah, both the government and the party of government, which is of course Labor, trying to win the next election, they do have to account for every dollar that they spend. And for them, right now, they would rather spend money on marginal seats than helping the rest of Australia. If they were to agree to cut the excise in half, they do have to then cut pork barrelling expenditure. I find it really, really difficult in circumstances where we gave more than $13 billion of taxpayers' money to companies who increased revenue throughout COVID, that Josh Frydenberg then says, sorry, there's no money to help battlers, there's no money to help Australian families or small businesses. That's just beyond comprehension to me. And it shows the mindset of these politicians that that always seem to be looking after vested interests, after their donors, and ignoring the people they're supposed to serve.
So, is it deliberate, or is it just oversight and just this obsession, this fetish of politics over policy? I'm just trying to get. They must look at suggestions like this and then contemplate them. I'm assuming you've got other members of the crossbench on board. Is Jackie Lambie, etc., on board?
I haven't spoken to Jackie about this. I know Pauline Hanson has now jumped on this. And look, one of the roles of the crossbench is to create pressure points where the government's not doing enough and the opposition is not prepared to stand up. So that's one of the things that we do. The Prime Minister is simply tone deaf. He won't act on this until it's a political crisis. We've seen the same thing in terms of veteran suicides with a Royal Commission. We've seen the same things with the ill treatment of women in the Parliament, and the Prime Minister acting only when the political pressure was so great. Instead of looking at things and saying, is this right? There's always a political calculation that they're carrying out, and that seems to dominate, and that's a great shame.
Clearly they have a long-term problem too, which they're never going to address because they're obsessed with clinging to power and getting back in and pork barrelling in order to stay in power. But longer term, if you've got an ageing population, rising healthcare and aged care costs, you've got AI, which is barely begun. So you're going to have the mechanisation of the workforce. So this business of having somebody that's 1 hour a week work, counting them as an employed person, with the gig economy and so on, you've got all this future pressure coming on our taxation base, and you've got, corporate characters like Exxon and, Shell and particularly Exxon and Santos and all these guys that don't pay any tax. I mean, Exxon, $60 billion over 7 years of income, $60,000 million, and not 1 cent in tax. You and I, of course, paid more tax than Exxon. So how, in the end, are they going to fund the future of this country? How are they going to do it? I mean, in the short term, your idea about easing the pressure on families is an obvious one, but they ignore obvious things because they've got to make it up in their budget somewhere. But what about the longer term program for this country? How's it going to pan out? What's a sensible policy here?
On the first day of sitting of the 46th Parliament, the Governor-General gave a speech, and I won't criticise the Governor-General. He was reading a speech prepared by the Prime Minister. And when I listened to that speech, I listened to a carve-up of the current economic pie, how they would distribute the money that they generate. And I was completely disappointed. There was no talk about growing the pie. There was no talk about making a tastier pie. It was just absent. I actually went back to my room to try and work out whether I'd missed something in the speech, but there was nothing there. There are 3 simple things I can give you now. I mean, there is more complexity to this, but 3 things that we could do to make it so much better for all Australians. First and foremost, we should be making our economy more complex by way of value adding and manufacturing. Stop just exporting rocks. Let's make steel, not export iron ore. Let's make lithium-ion batteries, not export lithium. Let's make product, not export research. We need to do more manufacturing here. That will enable us to generate jobs, to generate intellectual property, and to generate wealth which can circulate throughout the economy. That's the first thing we can do. The second thing we can do is make our tax system fairer. We have, from tax transparency data, knowledge that there are 150 companies in Australia that over the last 7 years earned $790 billion and paid not a brass razoo in tax. Baristas, nurses, teachers, doctors, all paid more tax than these companies. And that is just totally wrong. And the government is not doing anything about that. We need to look at that to work out how to close the loopholes, perhaps to look at a different way of taxing, but we have to fix that so that we have the money necessary to do all of the things that we need to do. And finally, we have a whole range of finite resources that are being tapped by multinational companies who then send that resource overseas, and we don't get compensated in any way, shape or form. We know that petroleum rent resource tax is broken. We have a situation where Qatar, who exports about the same amount of LNG as what Australia does, in their forecasting, they're taking $26 billion for the citizens of Qatar. We are taking 800 million.
That's the PRRT?
Yeah, that's looking at what we get in return for our resource. It belongs to us.
You're
not
looking
to the
at income
multinationals.
tax, corporate income tax, as well as the royalties and PRRT? Or?
Well, I think you also have to look at corporate tax. I mean, I don't understand how directors of companies operate with thinking that they can operate here in Australia, enjoy the benefits of our medical system, our education system, the roads that lead to their factory doors, the police force that keeps them safe, the defence force that makes sure that we have a safe country to operate in, and they don't pay a cent towards it. They've got no social licence. And they're the sorts of things that we need to fix. There are three simple things that if we did that, we would have enough wealth to solve almost all of the problems that we are dealing with right now. We wouldn't be struggling to find responses to the disasters that we're seeing in New South Wales and Queensland right now. We wouldn't be seeing what is happening in aged care facilities right now. We would have the investment necessary in education that is, an investment in our future. All of these things, if we simply focused on growing the pie, making it tastier, and sadly, no one in the government is proposing anything that does that. They seem to just want to fund gas projects.
Well, of course, even the IEA, all the international agencies are saying no more new fossil fuel projects. And we've got 50 on the boil, so there's a problem there. But is there the political will with the donations? Because everyone's a player in the game. In corporate Australia, they all donate. And so does that not create just a stasis, just a no opportunity to reform? Because the minute you get people coming through the door all day, lobbyists trying to swing you on this or that. I mean, is that the problem? I mean, is it?
Our system is corrupt. We have big corporate donors making donations that fund election campaigns, that are able to walk into ministers' offices and get their way. It's circular. The donations come. The government gets into power. It returns that through all sorts of grants or favourable legislation, and in effect, they're taking public money and using that to then feed back and influence an election, which gives private gain to MPs by allowing them to stay in office. That is corruption.
Now, before the election, which is slated for May, there's going to be the budget, which is going to be probably the signature piece of policy, or politics rather, for the government, because it's going to be an election budget. So presumably, even though they've blown the debt sky high, they're going to need to spend a whole lot of money to get people on side, to buy their votes from the people that actually vote, not the corporations, but the rest of us. What are we going to see, do you think, in this budget? Have they got anything up their sleeve? I know we're going to see leaks to friendly media organisations all the way to the very day. How do you think they'll play the budget?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because the Liberal Party like to spruik that they are the party of
superior economic management.
Of superior economic management, and yet if it's necessary to drop that in order to win an election, they will, and we'll have to see what the outcome of the budget is, how they intend to recover the money that has been spent throughout COVID. And all of the pork barrelling that's been done as well. It's just something we'll have to wait and see.
Are you saying they might actually come out with a policy, because they'll have to say in the out years how they're going to fund the deficits and how they're going to get their debt down?
Well, I think that's going to be really challenging for them. I think what will happen is this next year will be all rosy, and all of the pain will be put into the outer years, and I think that's how they'll try to manage this. I mean, this is not a government that does suggest to everyone that they are good economic managers. They also suggest that they're good in terms of defence. I look at what they're doing there, and it worries me. We've got a future submarine program that started in 2013. 13 years later, we've spent $3 billion, and all we have to show for it is a study into how we might go nuclear to get a submarine in 2040. Now, we've got this awful strategic circumstance that we find ourselves in. Ukraine could be the spark that lights the tinderbox, which is China and Taiwan. We've got Chinese warships transiting the Arafura Sea, lighting up Royal Australian Air Force aircraft. We've had Chinese warships in our waters over the last few years watching our exercises, and somehow Scott Morrison thinks that a 2040 submarine is going to be useful. The only way that submarine is going to be useful is if it's got a time machine in the back of it. We've seen an Army battle management system that's been cancelled. We've seen the Navy's $3.5 billion utility helicopter, an Army and Navy utility helicopter program cancelled. We've seen delays in the future frigate program. We've got this disastrous situation where all of the procurements, if they were to go well, and generally they haven't been, are going to deliver capability in 10 years' time, when in actual fact we need it right now. So, they profess to be the national security bastions, but if you examine it, they're failing, and they're failing on economic grounds as well.
Is there any difference, any significant policy difference between them and the opposition?
Well, it's interesting. I watched to see what the opposition say on defence, and almost always their answer is, "We don't have all the information. We'll have to wait until we're in government before we can make any real decisions." And that seems to me to be perfunctory.
Well, the small target policy for Albo is working, obviously, because he's up in the polls, at least as far as the polls go. So what do you think of this idea that he just tries to do his best not to have anything in the way of policy, then gets in and actually does something? I mean, is that a realistic proposition? Because clearly he doesn't want to put his head up with any policy, or he'll just get wedged on it by the government. What do you think of that approach to getting into power?
Well, I think it's relatively clear. I think Scott Morrison is going to lose this election.
Yeah.
It won't be that Albo won it. It'll be that Scott Morrison loses it. And it's shallow and disappointing that Albo is not standing up and saying what it is that he will do in government. He is the alternate government, and he ought to be open and honest with the Australian public about what it is that he's going to do. And I think there is weakness in his leadership in not being honest with the Australian public. On the fuel excise, his response is, we need to look at it. We need to understand the fiscal impacts of it. It's not that hard. Yet he just doesn't want to stick his head up because he thinks that's the way in which he'll end up being in office. And it's in some sense dishonest. You want people to basically spell out what they're going to do. Again, I want to hear him talking about growing the pie and making the pie tastier.
So what about the other real wild card in this election? It's coming with all this rash of independents. We've got a couple of dozen independents, and there's some good ones in there at the moment. Helen Haynes and Zali Steggall and so on, and they're popular and they're likely to get re-elected. What about speaking the Boothby candidate, Joe Dyer, who's having a run, and she this morning, and she said that she was hopeful but had no idea how it would go. I mean, is there any way? I know they will campaign a lot on local issues, they're more community based. Like you represent the people of South Australia rather than other people. So they'll campaign for their constituents. But how do you think they'll go? And what will they do when it comes to preference deals? And are they going to hurt the Greens, or are they just going to hurt the coalition? Or
yeah, look, I think people need to firstly recognise that independence can be good, but it comes down to the character of the person involved. A lot of people think that independents are just those that hold the balance of power and then do deals when it comes to legislation, and that's not what we do. What we do is look for government bills going through the Parliament, and we will move an amendment. And sometimes we'll move an amendment that the Labor Party might otherwise shy away from because they have division in their party. Well, by an independent moving an amendment, it forces them to take a position. Independents can call for inquiries that make oppositions uncomfortable. So on 6 occasions, I called for an inquiry into our relationship with China, and it was a well-meaning inquiry request, and it went back as far as 2018, and unfortunately, opposition didn't support that. Neither did the government. But we bring those issues to the table as independents. I can stand up and make a speech about tax cheats. And I know my colleagues on both sides of politics like what I'm saying.
They all agree with you, but of course they get donations from these guys as well.
They do, and what happens is if a member of the Labor Party stands up and makes a strong speech against someone for tax dodging, they're likely to get a tap on the shoulder by their leader saying, hang on, we're working with that organisation. They're a donor to us. And independents generally don't get donations from big corporations. We can stand up and say these sorts of things. So independents are, they're not about horse trading. They actually perform a real function. The fuel excise, I as an independent raised that, and I'm using the political system and the media to put pressure on the government to do something. Without an independent being around, this issue would not have been raised because it's uncomfortable for both sides.
You did, of course, bring a very worthy one. Was it last year, the secret rich list, the grandfathering, because there's 1,000 or so of Australia's richest people that enjoy a little lurk that none of the rest of us enjoy. They don't have to disclose their financial statements, so they can hide their tax affairs and so on more than other people. This thing is a no-brainer. It's been in since Paul Keating's time, didn't it? It was a special little exemption for the rich people then, and they've still got it. And this is a classic example. You tried to bring that one. You had the amendment going and attached to the bill, and you had Labor backing it, which was good. You're almost across the line. What happened there? And can we see that again if you get re-elected?
Well, sadly, that didn't get across the line. Again, this is the independent at play, introducing an amendment, building up the political will, and it took a couple of goes at doing this. Unfortunately, I got knocked over at the last minute by Pauline Hanson, who did a deal with the Treasurer, and that the Treasurer hasn't. The deal was, and it was described to me by Pauline Hanson, is we're going to solve this in another way. And of course, it hasn't been solved in another way. Pauline Hanson just got dudded and didn't realise, wasn't able to realise that she was being swindled. Again, that's the nature of the Senate. We have to get the votes, but it was an independent that put that up, myself, and that's one of the uses of independence. So, look, I would like to think that right around Australia, people who are looking, saying, I'm very uncomfortable with Scott Morrison, and there'll be people who are Liberals who have watched their conduct. And one of the problems for Scott Morrison is that he's lost the trust of many of his traditional voter base. It doesn't matter what policy he puts up now, people have lost trust in him, and they've lost trust because of things like sports rorts, car park rorts, strategic water purchases that were where the government paid well above tote odds for water, allowing a minister or an MP to have a blind trust. They're things that erode people's confidence in the Prime Minister, and I think a lot of Liberal voters will look and say, I don't want to vote for Scott Morrison. I don't really want to vote for Labor, and they'll park their vote with an independent. The role of the independents will always be to try and draw people from all sides to get enough to get across the line. If people are looking at independents, they can do a lot of good work. You just have to test the character of those independents. UAP, all of their candidates are checkbook candidates. No one knows anything about them. All we've seen from them from UAP is posters and shiny ads. And I really caution people to vote on the basis of a TV ad. If people want to look at what I do, they can go and have a look at my website. They can see all of the things that I've been up to, and if they like 8 out of 10 of those things, they can vote for me. And if they like all 10, they probably need a bit of help. But track record, or having a look at people's personality, testing them, questioning them. So there are independents, and then there are others that are purporting to be independents or purporting to be part of a party that I think that people just need to be very aware of whether or not it's real or very shallow.
So one of Rex's great passions, and it's a fantastic passion to have for the public, is doing FOIs. It's very strange. He stays up late at night, apparently, I'm told, filling out forms and demanding accountability and information, transparency from the government. And if he gets knocked back, he often takes it to the AAT. The AAT is the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, where you go to make a complaint about a government organisation or a government body. So Rex spends a lot of time doing this stuff. Now, what's your latest FOI crusade, Rex?
Oh, look, I've got about 15 on the ball, and including a federal court matter, trying to address the fact that the Information Commissioner takes so long to deal with appeals. This is the Australian Information Commissioner. Yeah, so there is such a thing. So if you make a request for information, and the basic principle is that everything that the government does, they do so on your coin and for public purpose. And we are entitled, because we have a responsible system of government, to see exactly what it is that the government's doing, and to even be able to interject in areas of policy development and have our say. Now, as a senator, I can ask questions in Parliament. I can use things like orders for production of documents. I can call for inquiries. As a regular person, the only real mechanism you have to reach in and peer into what government is doing is FOI, Freedom of Information. And you can ask the government for access to information. And unfortunately, there's this culture of secrecy which is led from the very top of government. In this case, the Prime Minister.
It's got worse, hasn't it?
Well, he's addicted to secrecy.
Yeah.
So that attitude flows all the way down through departments, and so officials are reluctant to give out any information at all. And so there's an appeals method where you can go to the Information Commissioner, but the Information Commissioner takes a lot of time, and time is the enemy of FOI. I've got matters still ongoing that relate to a cabinet document that was denied to the Parliament by a secretary of a department that is no longer there, and requested by a senator who has retired. Sometimes you just need access to information right now, and a lot of the requests that I have about activities that this government have carried out won't get answered until perhaps the next Parliament, where
they might be voted out by then,
and where they may well be gone. So I've actually got a matter before the federal court at the moment to say that the time taken by the Information Commissioner is unreasonable.
How are you funding that?
Actually, I've got two funders that have offered to indemnify me to $50,000. That's the Matilda Fund and also the Australia Institute. I'm still in the process of trying to get the court to agree to what's called a protective cost order, so that if I were to lose, I don't end up with a $200,000 personal bill. But it is a public interest matter. I'm hoping the court will simply say, let's stick with a protective cost order that comes to $50,000, which is covered off by those two organisations. But I have lots and lots of FOIs that are running all of the time at various different stages, either with the Information Commissioner or with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. I've just completed one hearing last week. I do almost all of it myself. And I've got a pretty good success rate, actually. I've got a good hit rate. The best, or perhaps the most significant one I did, was when Scott Morrison decided to form the National Cabinet, which I had no difficulty with. I didn't mind the idea of the Prime Minister calling the premiers together to deal with COVID. But when he did that, what he said was, National Cabinet is a cabinet, and so therefore there is the secrecy blanket that is placed across everything they do. Now that really offended me, because this was an organisation that was making decisions about people's liberties, about lockdowns, about crossing borders, about whether kids went to school, about whether or not, what was the vaccine policy. All of these sorts of things we are entitled to know about. The advice that has been received, medical advice that's been received, the economic advice that's been received, and he just wrapped his blanket over it. So I said, well, hang on, this is not a cabinet. A cabinet is a meeting of ministers responsible to one parliament that has features like collective responsibility and solidarity. And I looked at the National Cabinet. Of course, it's made up of ministers and of the Prime Minister and premiers who all owe their duty to their own jurisdiction. That didn't have cabinet solidarity. You would see the Prime Minister walk out and say, "This is what I'm doing." Then you'd hear Mark McGowan doing something different, Anastasia Palaszczuk doing something different. Didn't have any of the characteristics of a cabinet. I ended up taking that to the AAT, and it was such an important matter that the Information Commissioner, as soon as she got it, she said, "Nah, too hot," and she passed it up to the AAT. As soon as it got to the AAT, they recognised it needed to be heard before a federal court justice, and they have the ability to bring judicial officers in. And
you had a win.
I actually had a pro bono QC, Jeffrey Watson, a man of great integrity, came in and assisted me, and the government wielded out a QC to argue the case. And ultimately, Justice White ruled that National Cabinet isn't a cabinet and therefore is not subject to this blanket secrecy, and that's a huge win for the Australian public, because now people can put requests in to try and see how it is that decisions were made, and that's exactly how open and transparent government is supposed to work.
Could we just finally just wheel quickly back to the floods? That everybody seems to be so dismayed by these floods. Now, Barnaby Joyce was saying, we could never have done this 3,000-year, flood. And, there's lots of talks about biblical events and about, there's newspaper stories once in 10,000 years, and just pick a number really. But they were told, weren't they?
Yes, on the 5th of November, Emergency Management Australia gave a briefing to the National Cabinet, that is to the Prime Minister and all of the Premiers, on a national severe weather outlook.
What did that say?
And it said, amongst other things, that the likelihood of severe flooding was significantly greater than it had been in previous years. So the government knew back in November that what we're seeing playing out right now in Queensland and New South Wales was likely. And
so they had the scientific advice. They were told by their own forecasters that it was likely to happen, and yet they're out there describing it as a once in 3,000 year event where we've had 2 in 2 years now, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly. They knew it was going to happen, and this is the problem with the response. We see that in the very short term, the government hasn't mobilised the ADF quickly enough. I don't blame anyone in the ADF for that. That is the government that has been slow off the mark. We see in the sort of slightly longer term, the fact is they were warned about it but didn't do anything. Perhaps I look in the intermediate term. In 2018, the Senate did an inquiry that looked into how to utilise the Defence Forces in circumstances where we have these climate change related events, and that report went ignored. And of course, in the longer term, we have a government that simply has not dealt with climate change, and you can argue the toss, and people do, about whether or not this is caused by human activities. There is no question that climate change is occurring, and in circumstances where the outcome is what we've seen the last couple of weeks in New South Wales and Queensland, is so severe that you have to adopt what is the precautionary principle, and that means you have to act on it. So even those people that don't really believe that climate change is tied into human activity, and I'm not one of those, but there are people that don't believe that. There is something called the precautionary principle that says because the effect is so significant, you have to do something about it. And sadly, the Morrison government has done nothing.
I wonder how they go into a war then. They seem to be very keen on drumming up a war, but what would they do? I mean, they've been so useless at everything else, not following the professional advice. I mean, what would happen if there was a war?
Oh, look, I don't have much confidence in the Australian government. In fact, it's one of those questions I'm likely to ask at estimates next time around. If there was a war in a week's time, Chief of Defence Force, are we ready? Can we go? And sadly, I think the answer to that will be no. That, again, not directed at those servicemen and women who do a great job on our ships and in tanks and in aircraft. That is the first responsibility of government, and they have let us down.
Well, I think it's probably time to declare a state of lunch. So thanks very much, Rex. Good luck at the election.
Good on you, mate. Thank you.